Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. How are you today? Today you should be even happier than yesterday or than the previous lecture, because today is indeed the final lecture on consumption. And those of you who like consumption can look forward to, getting a total grasp of this part of the course. And those of you who hate consumption and are looking forward to the discussion on production can then get relief from this part of this segment of the course. But as I said in my previous lecture, that I hope you fall in the first category. Now, in our discussion in the previous lecture, we developed the rudiments of the indifference curve approach to analyzing consumption decision by a rational consumer. We saw what the difference between ordinal and cardinal approaches was. We developed the concept of an indifference map. First we drew the indifference curve, and then we saw that we could have a number of indifference curves representing consumer desires or consumer wishes and the levels of utility that those different combinations of goods that the consumer would want to consume would deliver. We looked at how the shape of the indifference curve would vary with the relationship between the good appearing on the vertical axis and on the horizontal axis. Crucially, we developed the concept of the marginal rate of substitution and the law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution, which was simply derived from the law of diminishing marginal utility. Then we also developed the concept of the price line or the budget line, which gave the feasible set of consumption choices that the consumer could make. I mean, it's the same question that we've been talking about since the first lecture, that the human wants are unlimited, but the resources that human beings have to satisfy those wants are limited. So in this particular case, we say that while human beings would want to consume as much as they can, so they would like to move on as high an indifference curve as possible, they're constrained by their income or their budget. Now, towards the end of the last lecture, we saw, or we promised, that we would talk about how a consumer chooses the point, that optimal bundle of goods that he should consume given a certain level of income. And this will be the starting point of our discussion today. Fortunately or unfortunately for some of you, it relies on a lot of graphical illustrations, and we'll have quite a few of them today. But believe me, this is a very important and interesting part of the whole segment of consumption that we've discussed so far. And if you can get a good handle of what we are going to do now, it will also facilitate greatly and vastly your understanding of production decisions by firms. And we will be getting to that after the end of today's lecture. So let's illustrate how a consumer would choose the optimal consumption point using indifference curves approach. Let's go to our first slide for today. Note that we will be putting together the two elements of the analysis that we have discussed so far. That is the indifference map and the budget line. Now let's look at our example. We don't use a table or specific values because we want to illustrate a concept, and therefore we use imaginary values, and we use indifference curve labels such as I1, I2, I3, I4, and I5. Now here you can see that the consumer would prefer to consume anywhere along the indifference curve I5 to anywhere along indifference curve I4. This is because I5 is the higher indifference curve, and any point or any combination of x and y on I5 delivers a higher level of utility for the consumer than any point along I4. Right? This is basic stuff which we covered yesterday. Similarly, points along I4 are all preferable to points along I3 because I4 is the higher indifference curve. However, now given the budget line constraint which has been illustrated by the connecting of points R, S, T, U, V, that is the budget line that we have, it is not possible to consume anywhere along either I5 or I4. Why is this? Recall from your previous lecture, all the area or the shaded area in this graph that is above the budget line represents the infeasible region of consumption. You cannot consume a bundle of goods which falls in the shaded area because that will fall outside what your budget or your income permits, right? So, the only feasible region that the consumer can consume on or within is the area inside or on the triangle which is connected by O, the origin, and the point of intersection with the x-axis and the point of intersection of the budget line with the y-axis. Given this, you can now see that the consumer can consume at certain points along I1, I2 and I3. So it is possible to consume at point R along curve I1. But to consume this combination of x and y would not be rational. Why? Because by moving to point S, which lies on a higher level of satisfaction, a higher indifference curve, the consumer could derive a higher level of utility because point S is on the higher indifference curve. But point S is not the optimum point either. It is possible to gain a higher level of satisfaction by consuming at point T, which is on curve I3. And I3 in this case is the highest indifference curve that can be reached for this particular budget. The optimum consumption point for the consumer then is where the budget line touches, or in other words is tangential to or is tangent to the highest possible indifference curve, which in this case is I3. So we are talking about point T. At any other point along the budget line, the consumer would get a lower level of utility. So points U and V would relegate the consumer to indifference curves I2 and I1 respectively, which will give him a lower level of utility than the indifference curve I3. Now, if the budget line is tangential to an indifference curve, they will then obviously have the same slope, because the slope of a curve is simply the slope of the tangent to it at the point in question, that is point T in our case. But as we have seen earlier, the slope of the budget line is simply the relative price ratio, that is the ratio of Px to Py, where x is the horizontal axis good and y is the vertical axis good. And the slope of the indifference curve is given by the, marginal rate of substitution, which is given by Mux over Muy, where Mu is the marginal utility. Therefore, at the optimum consumption point, Px over Py is equal to Mux over Muy. That is, Mux over Px is equal to Muy over Py. Now note that this optimal consumption point that we have identified for the consumer, that is point D, point T, at this point the Mux to Px ratio equals the Muy to Py ratio. And this is exactly the equimarginal principle that we derived in our previous lecture. So in some ways, the indifference curve approach has captured the essence, the heart of what the marginal utility analysis gave us in our previous lecture. However, the indifference curve approach note has not used any cardinal measure of utility. So we did not have utility on any vertical axis. We worked with quantities of goods. We had one good on the vertical axis and the other good on the horizontal axis. And merely by working with the marginal rate of substitution and the ratio of prices and marginal utilities, we were able to derive the same result that we derived when we used the explicit cardinal approach of marginal utility analysis. Now, note that using the indifference curve approach, we have seen how to maximize utility given a certain level of income. So remember that we drew a lot of indifference curves, right? I1 to I5, but there was only one budget line. And we saw how that budget line would then become tangent to one particular indifference curve, and that would yield the optimal point of consumption. However, we can also think of it in the reverse sense. We can say that given a certain level of utility that we have to achieve, what is the lowest budget or the least costly way of achieving that particular level of utility, right? So in this case, we would draw just one indifference curve, but draw many budget lines and see how that indifference curve can then become tangent to one of those budget lines to yield the optimal point. Let's analyze this using a graph. Now let us assume here that we want to obtain the level of utility indicated by the indifference curve I. What combination of the two goods X and Y should you consume? This is the question before us. Now by drawing a series of budget lines on the diagram, we can find the least costly way for us to achieve that level of satisfaction. This combination will simply be at the point where the indifference curve touches the lowest possible budget line, that is at point R. Any other combination of goods along the indifference curve will cost us more, that is, it will be on a higher budget line. So this is the other way of looking at the consumer's problem, that is how he can minimize the cost of achieving a certain level of utility. Now, we've seen how the consumer will choose his optimal consumption point given the prices of individual goods and given his level of income. Now, in our previous lecture, we saw what the impact would be on the budget line, which is the income constraint on the consumer, of a change in prices, that is of a change in relative prices, or of a change in the real income or the purchasing power of the consumer. And we saw that when the real income of the consumer changed, it was represented by a horizontal shift, rightwards or leftwards, in the budget line. Whereas when the relative prices changed, the slope of the budget line changed. Now we will see what the impact of income and relative price changes or simple price changes will be on the optimal choice, right? So we are looking at how the optimal choice or the optimal point of consumption changes when either the income changes or the relative prices change. Let's illustrate this through two examples. Let's go to our slide. Now, as you can see in this graph, we have units of good on the vertical axis, units of good Y, and units of good X on the horizontal axis, as per convention. Then we have drawn four indifference curves, I1 to I4. And we've also drawn four budget lines, B1 to B4. Now let's assume that we start from point R. That is, we have the budget line B1 and we are on the indifference curve I1, so that the maximization point, the utility maximization point for the rational consumer is point R, where the budget line B1 is tangent to the indifference curve I1. Now let's see what happens when the income, the real income of the consumer increases, either because of a proportionate fall in both the prices of Y and X. So let's say both Y and X fall by 10% or 20%, or by an increase in the money income that the consumer has. Both of these will have the effect of shifting the price line or the budget line outwards. So we will move from B1 to B2. Now because the income has increased and the budget line has shifted outwards, it is now possible to touch a higher indifference curve. That is, in this case, I2. So the optimal consumption point can now move in a northeasterly direction from R to S. Note that the critical thing here is that both the consumption of good X and the consumption of good Y have increased in moving from R to S. You are consuming more units of X and more units of Y at S than you are at R. Similarly, if the income increases to B3 and then to B4, then your optimal point moves to T and then U respectively. If you join this line which connects the R, S, T and U points, you get what we call the income consumption curve. It simply traces out the points which represent the optimal consumption choices at the different income levels for the consumer. Now this income consumption curve that we have derived, which connected the points R, S, T, U, is very important because what it helps us to do is derive the demand curve for one or both of the goods in income quantity demanded space. So remember, we derived the demand curve using the marginal utility curve in the marginal utility analysis lecture. And we saw how the marginal utility curve itself represented the demand curve, and that the area under the marginal utility curve was the total utility that the consumer derived, and then subtracting the total expenditure that the consumer would make, you would get the total consumer surplus. We don't have the equivalent of total consumer surplus and the other thing directly here, but we do have the income consumption curve, which we can then trace out in income quantity demanded space to get the demand curve in that particular dimensions. Let's look at how this is derived graphically. Now look at this income consumption curve for two goods, that is bread against CDs, that is compact discs. And we have, as we had earlier, 3 points, 3 optimal points representing the income consumption curve, points A, B and C, corresponding to the 3 different levels of income or budget of the consumer. Now note that if we want to derive the demand curve for CDs, then we will have to drop the bread axis and replace it by the income axis. So if you take down point QCD3 and point QCD2 and point QCD1 and drop them down to the horizontal axis in income CD space, you get those 3 quantities QCD3, QCD2 and QCD1 directly from the top graph. On the vertical axis, however, you have Y1, Y2 and Y3, which correspond with the 3 income levels corresponding to B1, B2 and B3 respectively. So Y1 relates to the budget line B1, at which the consumer achieves equilibrium at point A, which is also shown in the bottom graph. Similarly, point B is obtained when the budget line is at B2 and the income has risen to Y2. Similarly, Y3 obtains an equilibrium point or a consumption point at point C, which is corresponding to the B3 budget line. This particular curve is also called the angle curve. Earlier we just referred to it as the demand curve in Y or IQ space, but technically this is also called the angle curve, taken after the name of the great economist Engel, who did a lot of work on income elasticity of demand and related stuff. Now, if you've been avid listeners to me throughout this course, and if you've followed what I've been teaching you properly, the question must have come into your mind as to what the income the demand curve in income quantity demanded space would look like for an inferior good, and whether we can actually derive this new relationship, which would be negative for an inferior good, from the indifference curve analysis that we just used to derive the demand curve for a normal good. Note the distinction. A normal good is one whose consumption increases as the person's income increases, whereas an inferior good is a good whose consumption falls as a person's income increases. And we gave the example of margarine versus butter, that butter is a normal good, but margarine, being an inferior substitute, can be categorized as an inferior good whose consumption would fall as the consumer becomes richer and switches to better quality butter, which is the better quality product in this case. Let's illustrate through the use of a new set of graphs how you would derive the demand curve in income quantity demanded space for an inferior good. Let's go to our graphs. Note that we now have three new indifference curves denoted by I1 prime, I2 prime, and I3 prime. Note the difference in their shape relative to the graph that we earlier drew, where we had two normal goods. Here you can see that the indifference curves come in very close towards the northwest part of the graph. So the three lines, I1 prime, I2 prime, and I3, are very close, bunched together towards the northwest part of the graph, but they become fairly open when they come down towards the southeast part of the graph. And this is to reflect the fact that we are now in the realms of inferior goods. Now on the vertical axis we still have a normal good, that is CDs, but on the horizontal axis we now have margarine, which we will use here as the inferior good example. Now the budget lines are exactly the same as in the previous graph. So income increases from Y1 to Y2 to Y3, causing the budget line to shift from B1 to B2 to B3, causing consumption choice at A prime, B prime, and C prime. Crucially, however, note that while the move from A prime to B prime causes an increase in the consumption of CDs, it causes a decrease in the quantity of margarine demanded or consumed. So the quantity of margarine consumed falls from Q1 prime to Q2 prime, and then it falls from Q2 prime to Q3 prime. And this is happening while income is increasing. That is, as we are moving rightwards, the budget line is moving outwards. Now the analogy of this can be drawn in income quantity demanded space, where we can have Y1, Y2, and Y3 on the vertical axis, whereas Q1 prime, Q2 prime, and Q3 prime on the horizontal axis, which is the quantity demanded of margarine. And as you can see, unlike the previous example, we have a downward sloping or a negatively sloped demand curve. That is, as income increases, the quantity demanded of the good falls. So we have A prime as the lowest point, B prime as a point slightly higher than that, and C prime as the point most to the left of the graph. So this is how we illustrate the derivation of the demand curve for an inferior good from indifference curve analysis. So that is how we derive the demand curve in income quantity demanded space, or the angle curve as it is called, for an inferior good using indifference curve analysis. Now, we've seen how changes in income or the budget affect the price line or the budget line, and through it the point of optimal consumption for the consumer, and then how it can be used to derive the demand curve or the demand curve in income quantity demanded space. But how does the optimal consumption point change in response to a change in prices, right? Which was the other possibility in real life. Either our incomes can change or the prices of goods around us can change, or both can change, right? So we now look at how a change in prices and a change in price of one good can affect the optimal choice of consumption by a rational consumer. Let's illustrate this through the use of an example. Now, as you can see, we have the same old graph of ours with units of good y on the vertical axis and units of good x on the horizontal axis. Note that we use the assumption that good x costs rupees 20 per unit and good y costs rupees 10 per unit. So that if we devoted all our budget of rupees 300, we could buy 15 units of good x, which is the point of intersection of the price line with the horizontal axis. And if we devoted all our budget to the consumption of good y, we would consume 30 units of good y, which is the point of intersection with the vertical axis. Now, we can draw the two indifference curves I1 and I2 and see how the optimal consumption point changes or responds to a change in the price of x. Now, the initial budget line B1 corresponds to the earlier data, of course, where the budget was rupees 300 and the price of x was rupees 20 and the price of y was rupees 10. Assume now that the price of x is reduced to rupees 10 while the price of y remains the same as before, that is rupees 10. The new budget line B2 will therefore intersect the x-axis at twice the quantity that B1 does, that is 30 units of x, but will continue to intersect the y-axis at the same point. Thus, the curve has pivoted on point A. The old optimum consumption point was at J. After the reduction in the price of good X, a new optimum consumption point is found at K. Now, if we connect points J and K, remember we connected our earlier points R, S, T, U in the example of what happened when income changed, that is, there was a shift in the price curve. Here again we do the same, that is, we connect the two optimal consumption points, we connect J and K, and this gives us what is called the price consumption curve. Now, the price consumption curve is also very meaningful because it carries within it the demand curve for each of the two goods, that is X and Y. In this particular case, we can derive the demand curve for good X by taking the price of X on the vertical axis and the quantity demanded of X on the horizontal axis. So, as you can say, point J corresponds to point J in the lower graph with coordinates of rupees 20 on the vertical axis, which is the price of X at point J, and coordinate of 15 units on the horizontal axis, which is the quantity demanded at that price. As the price falls to rupees 10, that is, as the price line pivots about point A in the above graph, and you have a new horizontal axis intersection point at 30 units, we now have point K, and therefore the quantity demanded here is 30, and the corresponding new price is the lower price of rupees 10. Joining these 2 points, we get the familiar downward sloping demand curve. Now, that concludes our discussion of what happens to the optimal consumption point as either income changes or price changes. Now, if you recall from our earlier discussion on demand, which was I think in lecture 3, we said that economists wanted to dig deeper on why the consumption of a particular good or the demand for a particular good fell as the price of that good rose. That is, they questioned the law of demand and wanted to get to the bottom of this. And that they formalized it through the income and substitution effects. Now, if you could not fully grasp the income and substitution effects discussion, then this is another opportunity for you to grasp these two very important concepts. Let's now see how the change in the price of a good affects the demand for that good, that is, how it affects the optimal point of consumption for the consumer in indifference curve analysis, and then how this can be understood in the context of income and substitution effects. Not only will we look at what these effects are and how these can be illustrated graphically, we will also illustrate it for three distinct cases. That is, we'll illustrate the effect of a price rise and the sub-effects of income and substitution in the context of a normal good. We'll discuss it in the context of an inferior good, and we'll discuss it in the context of a giffen good, Giffen, which is a subcategory of inferior goods. Let's go to our three graphs which will help us illustrate precisely this. Now, as you can see, we have the familiar indifference curve graph with goods with units of good y on the vertical axis and units of good x on the horizontal axis. Now look at this graph, and it is the familiar indifference curve graph in y-x space. That is, you have units of good y on the vertical axis and units of good x on the horizontal axis. We have two indifference curves, namely I1 and I2, and we have two budget lines, that is B1 and B2. Now, in order to understand how we can break the price effect into the income and substitution effects, let me remind you that whenever we talked about a change in the price of one good, I said that we were talking about two things. We were talking about a shift in the price line, which happened because of the change in the purchasing power of the individual, and we were talking about the change in the slope of the price line, which was caused by a change in the relative price of x to y. Now, in this case, this is precisely what is happening. Let's first look at what happens when we change the slope of the price line. Note that we are using the example of a price rise in this case. That is, the price of x rises so that the price line shifts inward from B1 to B2. Now let's first see what is the implication of the change in the slope of the price line from B1 to B2. Now, as you can see, the price line is becoming more vertical. So we can draw a new line, a new price line, by rotating it around point F. This price line merely captures the substitution effect or the change in the relative price of x versus y. And this price line is shown by B1A. All that this is saying is that the consumer is being compensated for the loss in purchasing power so that we can focus exclusively on the effect on his consumption of the change in the relative price of x versus y. So we leave the issue of what the impact of the price increase is on the consumer's purchasing power, so that we can observe the sole impact or the exclusive impact of the relative price change on the consumption decision by the consumer. Now, as you can see, when you rotate the price line at F about the point F so that it becomes parallel to the new price line B2, you get the price line B1A, which is now tangent to the indifference curve I1 at point G. Now, as you can see, in moving from F to G, the consumption of good X has fallen. Now, this reduction in the consumption of good X is simply the substitution effect that we referred to earlier. And you know that the substitution effect is unambiguously negative for all goods. Now, in order to understand what the income effect of the price rise is, all we have to do is to shift the price line B1A inwards to the new price line B2. So all we do is now moved from point G to point H, right? Point G is the point at which B1A is tangent to I1, and point H is the point at which B2 is tangent to I2, which is the lower indifference curve. So this effect, that is the movement from G to H, represents the income effect of a price rise. That is the effect on the purchasing power of a consumer of a price rise. And you know that this effect is negative for a normal good. We can now look at the income and substitution effects for an inferior good. Note the slightly different shapes of the indifference curves, and these have been drawn particularly or specifically to see how the income and substitution effects can be of opposite signs. As you know, the substitution effect for an inferior good, as it is for any other good, is going to be negative. That is, as the price increases, the consumer will switch from this good to some other substitute good which is still cheaper. But the income effect for an inferior good is positive. That is, as the price of the good increases, the impact on the purchasing power is negative, and that in turn causes the consumption of that particular good to rise, because as the consumer becomes poorer, he wants to demand more of that good. Therefore, the income effect of a price rise is positive. When you say positive, all you are saying is that the direction of change in the quantity demanded of the inferior good is going to be the same as the direction of change of the price of that good. So if the price of the good increases, the quantity demanded of that good due to the income effect will be increasing. That is, the direction will be the same as the direction of the price rise. Now, if you look at the substitution effects and income effects graphically, you will note that the substitution effect takes the consumer from point F to point G, which is same, which is sort of negative as it was in the case of a normal good. However, instead of going from point G to point H in the leftward direction, we now move in the rightward direction. That is, point H is to the right of point G. That is, the income effect of the price rise causes the quantity demanded of the inferior good to increase. Now, in this particular case, we assume that the substitution effect is heavier than the income effect, so that the size of the left arrow is bigger than the size of the right arrow, and therefore overall the substitution effect dominates. That is, as the price of the good increases, its quantity demanded will fall. However, it is possible for the left arrow to be overwhelmed by the right arrow. That is, for the substitution effect to be overwhelmed by the income effect. And this is the case for a giffen good, which is shown in this new graph. The principle of analysis here is the same as it is for an inferior good. That is, the substitution effect is negative, but the income effect is positive. That is, a giffen good is just a special category of an inferior good. What distinguishes it from the general case of the inferior good is the size of the income effect. In this case, we see that the arrow pointing to the left, that is the substitution effect, which takes the quantity demanded from Qx1 to Qx2, is overwhelmed by the income effect, which is the rightward pointing arrow, which takes the quantity demanded from Qx2 to Qx3, so that the net impact of the price rise is an increase in the quantity demanded from Qx1 to Qx3. Now I will leave it to your good selves to go home and see how the demand curve for a giffen good can be derived from the indifference curve graph. Note that the demand curve should be positively sloped in PQ space. That is, as the price of the giffen good increases, the quantity demanded should increase as well. So you should not get the traditional downward sloping demand curve. Instead, you should get the upward sloping demand curve. So go home and practice with that a little bit. Now, before we conclude today's lecture and sum up on our understanding of demand, let me talk a little bit about the shortcomings or limitations of indifference curve analysis. Now, as you know, in economics, there are different approaches to studying the same thing. And while economists are happy with one approach, there are certain shortcomings which prompt them to switch to some other approach. So the traditional way in which economists argue is that, well, on the one hand, you have the advantages of this approach, but on the other hand, you have the disadvantages of this approach. And indifference curve analysis is not beyond that criticism. It suffers from the same problem that economists say, well, on the one hand, it offers us the escape from being forced to cardinalize utility or to measure utility in cardinal terms. On the other hand, it has certain disadvantages, which I will enumerate shortly. But before this, let me relate a small anecdote of Winston Churchill's in this matter. Winston Churchill, as you know, was the British Prime Minister in the 1930s and 40s. And he was a very good orator, and he has quite a few interesting sentences to his credit which have become very popular in very different subjects. So once he asked his economists for some advice on some issue. He said, "What is your advice?" And the economist, in his traditional style, said, "Well, Mr. Churchill, Mr. Prime Minister, on the one hand, this is the advantage of adopting this policy. On the other hand, you have this disadvantage." Well, Churchill wanted a clear and ready answer, that is either yes or no, whether I should go ahead with this policy or not. So he asked another economist, and then he said the same thing. He said, well, on the one hand, you have this advantage, and on the other hand, you have that advantage. And then Churchill, in a very interesting remark, said, "Can't you show me a one-armed economist so that he can't point to his other hand and say, on the other hand, you have this disadvantage?" So that was an interesting anecdote that you can keep with your memories. Now, coming back to the shortcomings of indifference curve analysis, that is the other hand arguments that economists present, there are basically 5. The first one is that indifference curve analysis is only possible for 2 goods, or at best 3 goods. That is, we can only draw an indifference curve graph in 2 or 3 dimensions. We've discussed the case for the 2-dimensional drawing, that is when one good is on the vertical axis and the second good is on the horizontal axis. And we could possibly do this in 3 dimensions, where you would have x, y, and z dimensions. So you would have a sphere type of an indifference curve, which would be bowed in towards the origin, but not further beyond that. But in reality, and there are many goods out there. There are millions or hundreds of goods that we consider every day in our purchase decisions. So indifference curve analysis to that extent is limited to the analysis of 2 or 3 goods at most. That's one criticism. The other criticism is that it is almost impossible to practically derive indifference curves. Now, can you imagine a consumer going out into the market and looking at all these, thinking about all these different combinations of goods that he could possibly consume, and then tell whether all these different combinations give him the same utility or greater utility or less utility? If they all give him the same utility, then obviously it will be the same indifference curve. If they give him greater utility, it will be on a higher indifference curve. And if it gave them less utility, it would be on a lower indifference curve. Theoretically sounds okay, but in reality it's practically impossible. There are millions of combinations of different goods out there, and it is not humanly possible for individuals to rank those different combinations. Therefore, in reality, it might just not be possible to draw those different indifference curves and to come up with the indifference curve map, which we then need to analyze the optimal consumption point for the consumer. So those are the first two criticisms. The third criticism is that the consumer that we assume in our indifference curve analysis is a rational consumer. But in reality, consumers are not always rational. When we go to a shopping mall or when we go to buy some goods in the market, we don't always pursue rationality in buying or in making our purchasing decisions. Sometimes we act impetuously. Sometimes we just want to buy a particular item. Sometimes we are in a rush. So we might not have the time to assess the costs and benefits and the relative value for moneyness of different goods and then make the optimal or rational decision. So that's the third criticism, that consumers might not behave rationally. And if they do not behave rationally, then the decision that they will arrive at will be different from the decision that indifference curve analysis tells us that the consumer will arrive at. The fourth criticism is that indifference curve analysis assumes that the consumer, when he chooses a particular consumption point as his optimal point, will get the utility from consuming the bundle, the utility that he assumed or he anticipated that he would get when he made the decision to buy that particular bundle. So if you go out to the market and you have decided that the optimal consumption bundle that you have to choose is, let's say, 2 mangoes and 3 oranges, that decision is based on the perceived utility that you think or you believe that you will derive from consuming that combination of 2 and 3. But let's say you actually bought those 2 oranges and 3 mangoes and took them home and then consumed them and found that one of the oranges was very bitter, right, or very sour, or found that the mango was overripe, right, and it was too sweet and not as good as you thought it would be. Now in this case, the utility that you actually derive from consuming the optimal bundle is different from the utility you thought you would have derived. So in this case, indifference curve analysis might not give you the optimal consumption or the optimal point of consumption in an ex post sense. That is, once the consumer has bought the goods and seen what their actual utility is. Now the final and perhaps most substantive criticism of indifference curve analysis is that it cannot help with the consumption decisions of regarding durable goods, that is, goods that are bought once in a lifetime or once in many years. We gave the example of washing machines. Other examples could be refrigerators or cars or even houses. You know, indifference curve analysis assumes that marginal increases in one quantity are traded off against marginal decreases in another. So as you move down the indifference curve, you are increasing the quantity of one and decreasing the quantity of the other. But with durable goods, it's not like that. So for example, if you had the trade-off between mangoes and refrigerators, if somebody said, okay, I'll give you 2 mangoes more, will you buy 0.25 of the refrigerator less? Well, that doesn't make sense, because 0.25 of the refrigerator does not mean anything. It's either the full refrigerator or nothing, right? And indifference curve analysis can't deal with that because it uses a smooth indifference curve. The indifference curve is not like shaped like this, like a step up or step down setup. It is a smooth curve which assumes that marginal increases can be traded off against marginal decreases. We can also illustrate this through the use of a graph, but this will be included in your lecture handouts so that you can go home and look at that and understand better how this criticism holds up against indifference curves. So broadly, my friends, that concludes our discussion on the demand side or the consumption side of our economic agent. From our next lectures, we'll talk about the production side. But before we get to that and get to exactly what we will be discussing, let me do a little recap on what we've learned about consumption and demand in these last 4 lectures. Now, if you recall, we started with a discussion of rationality and what rationality consisted in, what rational consumer behavior would be. We talked about the marginal utility approach to analyzing the consumption behavior of rational consumers. We established the law of diminishing marginal utility and used the marginal utility insights to explain why things like, or goods like diamonds would have such high market value, whereas something like water, which had such high intrinsic value and such essential or necessary role in our lives, would sell for so cheap. So marginal utility analysis could help explain those paradoxes. Then we concluded that the marginal utility approach ran into the problem of cardinality. That is, you had to assume that utility could be measured in cardinal terms. And we said that that was not an assumption that economists were comfortable with. So we saw what the distinction between cardinal and ordinal was. We saw that an ordinal approach merely required the consumer to give a ranking of different combinations or different bundles of goods. And we saw that that was easier than the consumer actually pointing out that, fine, this combination gives me 10 utils of utility and this combination gives me 12 utils of utility. Whereas ranking these different bundles was easier. We saw how the indifference curve approach could give us or lead us to the equi-marginal principle that we derived in the marginal utility analysis. But this time, we did not have to make the assumptions of cardinal measurement of utility that we had to in the case of the marginal utility approach. Then we also saw how the indifference curve approach could be combined with the budgetary constraints that we have, that is the budget line and the price line, to yield the optimal consumption point for the consumer. And we saw how that optimal consumption point then responded to changes in prices and income. We saw how the price increase in a particular good could impact the quantity demanded or the optimal quantity consumed of that good. And we broke the price effect down into the income and substitution effects. We saw that the substitution effect was negative for all types of goods, but we saw that the income effect was positive for inferior goods and was so positive for a giffen good that it overwhelmed the substitution effect to give us a positively sloped demand curve in PQ space. That's broadly what we covered today. And yes, we also covered the shortcomings of indifference curve analysis. So, from our next lecture, dear friends, we will be discussing production. We will see how firms choose what quantities to produce and decide on what prices to charge. We will look at the different market structures that firms operate in. We look at perfect competition, we look at monopoly, we look at imperfect competition, oligopoly. We look at all these different things and how producers' production decisions change depending on which market structure they operate in. So until next time, go back and brush up on your understanding of consumption. Get comfortable with these indifference curves, these budget lines, what causes shifts in these budget lines, what causes changes in the slope of these budget lines. Understand the law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution and the law of diminishing marginal utility and how they relate with the slope of the indifference curve, the slope of the budget line. Understand how optimal choices, consumption choices are made, that is at the point of tangency of the budget line to the indifference curves and things like that. So go home and also practice the questions I've put up on the web for you. I'm sure that with these lectures, these 4 lectures, you will take home a good and solid understanding of consumption, which will not only help you in this module, but also help you in our future discussion on production. So till next time, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.